Welcome to tonight's talk on Maine's first ship with James Parmentier. We're in webinar format, so please use the Q&A feature to ask questions of tonight's speaker. And I'm going to turn things over to our president, Owen Matthew. Unmute. There you go.
Gotcha. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Salem Athenaeum and to another installment of our speaker series. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. James Parmentier. If I didn't already know the term Renaissance man, I find it very difficult to describe our speaker. Jim is a PhD biologist who spent over 40 years in a varied career as a research scientist, primarily involved in pharmaceutical development and in teaching. One picture that tells me all that I need to know about Jim is one of him holding a cobra by the throat and milking it for venom, which he was harvesting in the 70s while participating in a project to develop anti-sera for the U.S. Army troops in tropical climates, primarily Vietnam. Jim retired to Brunswick, Maine in 2012 following his final professional stop as an associate professor at the Institute of Health Professions at Massachusetts General Hospital, lecturing primarily on the methodologies of clinical research. Along the way, Jim has been an author, a singer, a musician, the secretary of his college class for 25 years, a lifetime sailor, and of course, a boat builder. While his talk today is on a community project to build a 30-ton, 60-foot ship, he has built on his own about a half dozen boats in his home workshop over the years, and is currently finishing up a robust wooden 19-foot lobster boat. Jim also currently serves as president of the board of directors of Bath Brunswick Respite Care, an adult daycare center in Bath, Maine, for functional elders with dementia. Tonight, we will learn about the nearly 20-year-long rebuild of the Virginia of Sagadahoc. The original ship was built in 1608 by English settlers to transport them back to England after a failed attempt to successfully establish a colony at the mouth of the Kennebec River in Maine. Finally, since transparency is so important a topic today, I should probably add that most of my information on our speaker comes not from a submitted bio sketch, but from being lucky enough to have known Jim for the past almost 60 years. Jim, take it away, please.
Thank you, Owen. I appreciate that kind introduction. As Owen mentioned, I'm a board member of Maine's First Ship, this nonprofit organization in Bath that's constructing the first ocean-going vessel built by Europeans in the New World. It was built during an unsuccessful settlement attempt here in Maine. Named the Popham Colony by later historians, the ship they built here, the settlement lasted only 14 months, but the ship began the 400-year-old history of shipbuilding that we have here in Maine. Now, I want to acknowledge at the outset that during my talk, I'll be recounting stories derived from European records, European culture, European interests. Such traditional historical research can offer coherent pictures of goals and expectations and decisions of the colonists, but we have only an incomplete understanding of the Wabanaki experience of these encounters. During my talk, I'll use the name Wabanaki because that's the preferred collective name of the people who were living in Maine at the time of first contact and who live there today. Near the end of my presentation, I'll mention some projects that Maine's First Ship is underway in collaboration with representatives of the Wabanaki Confederacy to incorporate contemporary research on Wabanaki culture into our museum exhibits and to encourage additional such research through higher educational institutions in Maine. The historical record of the settlement is meager, often second-handed, replete with bias, over-optimism, self-interest. The basic outlines of the story, however, have been confirmed by 20th century archaeological studies. And then there's the ship, built completely with hand tools, outdoors during a cold Maine winter 400 years ago. About all we know of it is its stated design, a sketch of its possible rigging, and the fact that it made 2 successful transatlantic crossings. But from that, we conclude that she was a pretty well-built vessel. So I'm going to stop my video right now. You don't need to look at my face, and I'm going to share the screen with you. And someone can tell me that That should be the title slide. And if someone doesn't see the title slide, someone should let me know.
It looks
It's the
good.
title slide, Jim.
All right, great. All right. So the short version of the Popham Colony is that in 1608, 100 men left Plymouth, England, and landed at the mouth of the Kennebec River. They built defenses, some dwellings, a chapel, and a storeroom for a large supply of goods and material that they brought with them. They sought out and traded with the Wabanaki. They built a small maneuverable ship with which to explore the nearby rivers and coastlines. And after 14 months, the colony folded. They rigged their new vessel for an ocean passage, and in company with a much larger resupply ship, they sailed it back to England. To understand the Popham Colony, we need to know a bit about the economic and political history of Europe during the years before the colony was attempted. This is the Edward Bonaventure. Spain and Portugal were the maritime superpowers of the 15th and mid-16th century, but the English also knew how to build deep-water vessels. On this ship, the English ship, Richard Chancellor tried to find a passage to India via the Arctic route in 1553, in other words, sailing to the east. Around the same time, there were expeditions by John Locke and Thomas Windham that followed the coast of Africa as far south as modern-day Guinea. In addition, Europeans knew about the trade routes that went around the southern tip of South America and into the Pacific. In North Atlantic waters, 50 years before the Chancellor voyage, England's Henry VII had commissioned an Italian explorer, John Cabot, to sail west and look for a direct route to Asia. Now, if you do that, you'll reach first Labrador and then Newfoundland, and finally the St. Lawrence River, which penetrates deeply into the continent. Cabot's expeditionary discoveries were the basis for the English claim on North America. Jacques Cartier made several explorations to North America for France, also looking for the Northwest Passage. And during the 1600s, French and Basque traders made many trips to the North Atlantic. By the start of the 17th century, then there were hundreds of European fishing vessels each summer working on the Grand Banks. Fish was in big demand in predominantly Catholic countries where roughly 1/3 of the year was designated for fasting, which meant meatless days. So let's go back to London, 1606. On your left is a portrait of Queen Elizabeth, who reigned over England for 45 years and had passed away 3 years before. She died childless and unmarried, which by definition at that time meant virginal. Our US state of Virginia, as well as the two ships I'll be describing tonight, were named after her. On the right is James I, and now he is King of England. During her reign, Elizabeth focused much attention on solidifying Protestant rule over Britain and Ireland, but she also had to contend with a steady decline in relations with Spain. These had begun 40 years before, back at the time of her ascension as a Protestant queen to the English throne. She'd refused a marriage proposal from Philip, King of Spain at the time. Philip had not opposed her ascension. Apparently, he felt she owed him something for that gesture. Elizabeth did not agree. In 1570, she was excommunicated by Pope Pius V. That ban was renewed in 1585. The same year, active hostilities between the two countries broke out. Philip, encouraged by several successive popes, continued until his death in 1598 to make unsuccessful political intrigues and inconclusive military efforts to establish Catholic rule in England. The best known of those Spanish efforts is the invasion attempt by 112 warships that appeared in the English Channel in July of 1588. The English, commanded by Sir Charles Howe aboard this ship here, the Ark Royale, which is the name that the British give to every ship that carries a monarch at some time, aided by the so-called Protestant wind, which you can see depicted up in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, they decimated the Spanish Armada. By the time the Spanish fleet had been blown down the English Channel and clawed its way back up around the northern coast of England and back to Parma, the score was 64-2, as measured in sunken ships. Although undeclared hostilities with Spain continued for the next 15 years, after that battle, England took its place as a world-class power. Support for these late 16th century naval encounters was managed differently by England and Spain. Philip was able to spend and eventually exhaust monies in his treasury that had been collected for many years from Spain's overseas colonies. The convoy system of sea routes that linked Spain with its territories in the Americas was the world's first permanent transatlantic trade route and one of the most successful naval operations in history. These convoys were made up of both general purpose cargo ships carrying agricultural goods and lumber and sugar and tobacco and silk, but they also included galleons, large military warships, fitted with sharpshooters in the rigging and heavy cannon on the gun decks. And these were the ships that carried and guarded the gold and silver from mines in Peru and Mexico and protected other ships in the convoy. Elizabeth, on the other hand, didn't have ready access to financing for war with Spain because she had to coordinate with Parliament, which was always reluctant to increase tax. Instead, she issued letters of marque to self-financed seagoing entrepreneurs who were allowed to keep most of the captured Spanish goods wherever they found them. These privateers plundered both Spanish colonial settlements and the treasure ships and made huge fortunes for some names that are quite familiar to us. In 1604, James ended these expensive skirmishes by signing the Treaty of London. Its most important provisions were: one, Spain would recognize Protestant monarchy of England, and two, England would end its disruption of Spanish shipping. James kept his word and revoked all letters of marque, which had the immediate effect of turning all privateers into pirates. That, in turn, made many adventurous but unemployed seamen available for other projects, such as the establishment of overseas colonies. The Treaty of London made the Atlantic safe again, and English commercial interests soon returned to seeking valuable commodities along the coastline of the New World. By 1606, the headlands of the North American coastline had been mapped in more or less detail and accuracy. This map is attributed to a young Samuel Champlain, who took part in a French expedition to North America in 1604. So Champlain recognized Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and he knew about the Bay of Fundy. He didn't get Cape Cod quite right. He described Long Island Sound, did a nice job with the Chesapeake Bay. My point here is that the coastline was not unknown territory. While the Popham Colony ship captains would never have seen this particular map, there were others equally reliable or unreliable available in England. What attracted these commercial interests? Well, I've already mentioned the demand for codfish. Furs are always in fashion. Mineral wealth was to be expected. Just look what the Spanish had been bringing back from Central America for the past 60 years. But lumber was important too. Pinus strobus, the eastern white pine, grew straight and flexible in old growth forests all along the northeast coastline, rising 100 feet into the air, very suitable for making masts. By 1600, that's 100 years before, by the time we're dealing with this here, England had depleted much of its own mature forest land. Shipbuilders had been making the difficult trip up north and around between Denmark and Sweden to cut trees on the shores of the Baltic Sea, but the New World territories offered unlimited supplies of oak and pine, and wealthy merchants were interested in making such investments. These overseas commercial interests mesh well with the geopolitical goals that King James wanted to pursue in the New World. He intended to enforce England's sovereignty on territorial claims and to block encroachment by the Spanish and the French. But, like Elizabeth before him, he didn't want to argue with Parliament about using public money. So, like Elizabeth before him, he turned to entrepreneurs. In the spring of 1606, James granted a land use charter to the Virginia Company to establish 2 permanent settlements in North America. In turn, the company created 2 separate investment structures, one based in London, the other in Plymouth. Investors could support either or both ventures. The London-based company would go to land we now call Virginia and North Carolina. The Plymouth-based company would locate in New England. The overlapping middle ground would go to whichever settlement was strong enough to claim it. The companies were instructed to settle at least 100 miles apart near the mouth of a major river that would give access to the interior and at a site that could be hidden from passing French or Spanish ships. The principal backer of the Plymouth Company was Sir John Popham, at that time the Lord Chief Justice of England. The other primary backer was Sir John Gilbert. The company had two ships, one owned by the Popham family, the other owned by the Gilberts. These two families, along with other investors and business leaders, were colleagues and friends who had benefited greatly from decades of maritime and political experience. And so it was that in December of 1607, three ships of the South Colony, Godspeed, Susan Constant, and the Discovery, left London, reached the New World in late April of 1607, and landed on May 14th at a defensible site on the James River. They named their settlement Jamestown. It struggled, but it survived to become the first permanent English settlement in North America. This slide shows modern reconstructions of those three ships docked in present-day Jamestown. On May 31 of that same year, two ships of the North Colony, Mary and John and the Gift of God, left Plymouth. They got separated in a storm, and after some 60 days made landfall about a week apart in Nova Scotia. They proceeded west along the coastline to the mouth of the Kennebec River, and by August 16th, they were anchored off Sabino Point, a stubby little peninsula that projects out into Atkins Bay. They landed just 2 months after the Jamestown colonists. George Popham, nephew of Sir John Popham, was named president of the colony. The colonists named their colony Fort St. George. In time, it has come to be called the Popham Colony. There are several historical records of letters and accounts available to us that discuss the Popham Colony from the European point of view. This slide shows a few of them. The most detailed of these is a journal written by John Davies, the navigator on Gilbert's transport vessel, the Mary and John. It covers the colonist activity from the time the ship left Plymouth through the landing in August and on till early October, when Mary and John left the Kennebec as planned and returned to England. This is a speculative drawing by Sam Manning of what Fort St. George might have looked like by October of 1608. The settlers had cleared, trees and built defenses, protective ditches, earthen barriers of baskets filled with dirt and stone, quite probably, enough to keep out predators and neighbors. They built some simple living quarters and a forge and a chapel and a storehouse to protect the large amount of supplies that they had brought with them. We know very little about the daily workings of the colony. The men seem to have been skilled laborers with a collective knowledge of carpentry and stonework, some blacksmithing, and, as we will see, shipbuilding. They were hired to perform specific tasks and perhaps receive some small share of a treasure that might be found. They had no intention of staying in the New World and starting new lives there. We call them colonists, but our historian Ken Borgendale calls them the crew of Fort St. George. In his journal, Davies writes that by October, Gilbert had made one trip with 12 men in a small boat across Casco Bay, and George Popham had traveled up the Androscoggin River to what is now Brunswick, and Robert Davies, John's brother, had gone with a group of men up the Kennebec River, at least as far as Richmond. The purpose of these trips was to meet with members of the Wabanaki Nation and set up trading arrangements. We don't have any stories or reports of these or other first contact events that have come down to us from within the Wabanaki culture or communities. Maine's first ship is working with persons at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor to support the development of understanding of the 5 Wabanaki nations that today are thriving and growing in Maine and beyond. The Abbey's museum exhibits introduce visitors to the Wabanaki culture and history of the people. There you'll find oral traditions, personal stories, cultural knowledge, language, historical accounts, along with objects and photographs and multimedia events that provide a wide variety of content and perspective on the more than 12,000 years of history, conflict, adaptation, and survival in the Wabanaki homeland. I encourage anyone interested in this period of history to explore the Abbey Museum website. Here's Manning's settlement slide again. In one of the letters sent home to the investors, President Popham reported that a Mr. Digby and his men had begun building a, quote, a pretty pinnace of some 30 tons, end quote, soon after they arrived at the settlement site. The word pretty in this sense meant a sturdy and reliable. That pinnace would become the Virginia and I've circled it in this sketch. We can safely assume that Digby had recruited a good crew of workers for his operation, although we don't know how many there were. Skilled woodworkers would have brought some of their own tools, as many of our main ship volunteers do today. The transport ships also brought the sails, the lines, the hardware necessary to outfit Virginia once she was constructed. These men were not testing their abilities to build a ship. They knew how to do that. They were demonstrating to the world that here on the Maine coast were resources that would allow England to maintain its dominance in all matters nautical. Building Virginia was an objective, not a byproduct of the Popham Colony. Now we can go quickly through the remaining history of the Popham Colony, mostly because we don't have much information about it. When the Mary and John left in October 8, after 5 weeks of unloading cargo, it carried a hopeful letter to King James that things still looked pretty good. Popham then delayed the return of the Gift of God, the other ship. It was, after all, his family's ship. He could do that to help protect the colony from possible French discovery. As winter approached, however, the threat from the French seemed less probable, while the threat from the weather increased. The Gift of God encountered problems with ice flows in the river, and the colonists were running low on food. When the ship finally left in mid-December, Popham decided to send half the colonists back to England in order to conserve supplies. During the winter, the colonists' problems continued to mount. In February, the 57-year-old President Popham died of unknown causes, and young Raleigh Gilbert took over the leadership. Gilbert's immediate problem as the new leader was the winter. Bath is located at 43.9 degrees north. If you follow the 44th parallel east across the Atlantic, you come to Bordeaux, and then Nice, and that lovely city that's on the shores of the Mediterranean where France touches Italy. Winters are not bad there. That's probably what the colonists expected. The early 17th century, however, experienced weather so cold in both Europe and North America that it's come to be called the Little Ice Age, as you can see on this graph. It was a difficult time, but we have no contemporary accounts of it. Digby and his crew, however, kept working away, and spring eventually came. There's one report, written many years later, of a resupply ship coming in June, but the next thing we know for sure is that the Mary and John returned to Popham in August of 1608, carrying the sad news from England that a decision had been made to abandon the colony. Some of the sad news on the Mary and John was that Sir John Popham had died, and also Gilbert's father. The remaining investors knew that the Gift of God had returned empty-handed, with half the colony's starving members. Facing the prospect of another cold winter, Gilbert also realized that he too would be empty-handed if he didn't return to England and claim his inheritance. Considering all this, it's not surprising that the settlement effort ended. But by late summer, the shipbuilders had completed their ship. They named her the Virginia of Sagadahoc. Sagadahoc was the name the Wabanaki gave to the Kennebec River. They refitted her coastal rig for an ocean voyage, and in mid-October of 1608, in company with Mary and John, they sailed her back to England. Now, it's unlikely that the investors sent Digby to build just one vessel. In their proposals to the king, the backers clearly stated their belief that shipbuilding and its supporting trades were well suited for the New World and should be encouraged. The founders of Fort St. George fully expected that in time, a sustainable colony would grow up around it. Why it failed could be a good topic for our discussion section. Now, the Virginia appears twice more in the colonial record before being lost to history. Shortly after returning to England, the Plymouth colony sold her to the London colony for use at Jamestown. So in the June of 1609, she joined a convoy of 8 resupply ships headed back across the Atlantic. I'm showing you this Jamestown slide to give you a size comparison among these ships. The Discovery replica, the smallest ship that's out there, was rated at 20 tons. That's the one in the middle, just 38 feet long. The Godspeed was shown sailing in New York Harbor, that's up above there, was 40 ton at about 68 feet. And Susan Constant, the large one, was 116 feet overall, 120 tons. Virginia, the one that we're talking about tonight, was 30 tons, sort of midway between those two smaller ships. She was last recorded as having been sent on a fishing expedition into the Chesapeake Bay. In the upper left of this picture is Jane Stevens. In 1983, Jane moved into her childhood home, which is located on the eastern side of Sabino Point. About half of her house is within the footprint of the Fort St. George site. For many years, she'd been hearing local stories about a colony of Englishmen who settled there and built a ship 20 years before the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth. Jane contacted Dr. Jeffrey Brain, an archaeologist who works at your near neighbor, the Peabody Institute in Salem. That's Jeff holding the stadia rod in the middle of Jane Stevens's backyard. Working with volunteers, school children, dedicated supervisors during the summers between 1997 and 2013, Dr. Brain excavated your available property. These excavations unearthed a variety of 16th century artifacts of European origin, including on the left, a rusted caulking iron. That's a definitive shipbuilding tool. And on the right, an English shilling. The other objects on the left are roves. Those are pieces of metal used by boat builders to bend back the tips of fastening nails that hold planks onto the frames for clinker-built boats. The evidence uncovered during these excavations confirmed the existence of the Popham Colony and supported much of what we read in the historical record. The artifacts are on display in the Maine State Museum in Augusta, and Maine's first ship has pictures and replicas of several of them in our Jane Stevens Exhibit Center in the Bath Freight Shed. Now, one of the primary sources used by Dr. Brain was a map of Fort St. George that was found in 1888, quite a ways after it would have been prepared, of course, in an archival museum in Spain. The map was in excellent condition, delicately drawn on clean, strong paper, all of which argues that it was redrawn from an earlier map. That earlier map is attributed to one John Hunt, who was presumably one of the Popham colonists. Now, there's a lot of information on this map, including the fact that it shows specific buildings, several of its specific buildings to be concordant with the archaeological remains that were located at the worksite. We can discuss this map more in the Q&A session if anyone's curious, but right now I want to draw your attention to the left edge of the map. A common device used by map makers, both then and now, to indicate a body of water on your map was to draw a boat floating in it. If you expand the Hunt map, as I did, and rotate it, you'll recognize the sketch of a small sailing vessel, a single-decked, high-sided, shallow draft, square-stern hull carrying a spritsail and a headsail. That drawing became the basis for the design of our Virginia. So that constitutes our history lesson. So let's build a ship. Starting in 1997, Maine's first ship began a two-phased research program to lay the groundwork for actual ship construction. The first phase was to develop a historical concept design using pictures and descriptions available in the literature. Now, there's little documentation for any ship that was constructed 400 years ago. Ship design in that era was valuable intellectual property, and like nautical charts or productive fishing grounds, shipbuilding techniques were carefully guarded secrets. John Bradford, a historian who worked for many years on the Virginia project, described a pinnace as a relatively fast, lightly constructed, shallow draft support vessel for fishing and trading, exploring, cargo carrying, had a distinctive square or flat transom. They were open deck workboats, common on English rivers and coastal waterways at the time. In this engraving of ships on the Thames is about mid-17th century. I've circled a pinnace and two others can be seen. The result of several years of library research and collaboration between early MFS board members and nautical historians in this country and in England was a working design for our Virginia. In the interest of time, I'm passing over a lot of background work and research contributions by several individuals who studied early British maritime literature and maps to come up with a design like this. The person who developed the working designs was David Wyman, an independent naval architect and professor of marine engineering at Maine Maritime Academy. His work is summarized in a book by John Bradford, shown in this next slide. Bradford's book is entitled An In-Context Design of Maine's First Ship, published in 2011 and available in our museum store. It presents the thinking behind the design process. It describes how to build a ship, and it was accompanied by a complete set of working blueprints that have been consulted regularly throughout the past decade as work on the ship has progressed. Here's a Google map photo of the Virginia worksite. We're just north of the US 1 bridge over the Kennebec River in Bath that you can see at the bottom of the slide. The ship is being built in the larger of these two white tents. By 2010, the Virginia project had raised enough money to enter into a lease agreement for the property between the freight shed and the river. You begin building a ship by laying its keel, which is the backbone of the ship. Virginia's keel is made from white oak, and there's precious little of that left in New England. Now I made a mistake, but I will continue. Once we laid down the keel, we built a hoop tent that would protect it from the weather. Here's a diagram of that working, the working diagram without the rigging. Focus of Bradford's book had both the hull construction and the rigging, but I'm going to focus on the construction tonight. And these are the points of basic points when you talk about constructing a ship. You've got planking on the outside, you've got support frames on the inside, the deck, the stem at the forward end. The keelson is a support system on the inside, which we'll show you. The keel, the rudder, and the transom in the back. Now, I have put this diagram in a number of the future slides so that when you see it, it'll help you come along to understand what's being done. And just remember, there may be a few nautical terms that are used. Ignore them. For the most part, what you got to remember is that you've got a large ship that's being built with small pieces of wood. So you begin the ship's construction by lofting out the frames of the ship. We're going to start with the stem in this case. The lofting project tells the individuals to draw the working diagrams out in real shape on the floor of, in this case, the freight shed, and then transfer those diagrams to small, thin pieces of plywood so that you will have the structure of the piece, whichever it is that you're going to begin with, going to build. Here is the stem with those small pieces above it. You place that on pieces of white oak, 4 inch by 5 inches white oak, and you cut them out on a bandsaw. You'll see another picture of that a little bit later on. Here's the picture of that stem being put into place at the front of the keel. The brown wall behind is the end of that large shed, that hoop tent that we were building. And there's the little diagram that tells you which piece we're looking at this time. Here is a shot of the stem being bolted to the keel in place. You then build the frames of the ship. Now, the frames of the ship are built in sections. The terms for them are futtocks. They are small curved sections, and you'll see in a minute that the frames themselves are the ribs that come up on either side. There's no tree large enough to get the full curve of a ship out of one tree. And so you have to do this by putting together a series of pieces of wood that, if you cut them following the grain of the wood, you maintain the strength of that wood as the futtocks get assembled. And here you see lofted pieces for the futtocks that will be cut out from, again, 4 to 5 inch pieces of white oak. This is a diagram looking downward from the deck of the ship. I want to describe to you the frames and how their structure occurs. There's 64 frames on the ship. They are double sawn. That means that there are 2 similar pieces that are put together, and I'll show you how that works. What you're looking at here, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but each one of these is the upper end of a frame. You have transverse frames that run across the ship, paired on either side, port and starboard, and then you have a series of small frames that face forward called cant frames that provide strength to the bow of the forward end of the ship. This is one of the half frames. This would be a port or a starboard side of a single frame for the ship. Its opposite partner is the one there at their feet. If you look closely at this, you'll see that the frame is assembled, as I said, from a series of curved pieces of wood. They're held together by wooden pegs called trunnels. You can see the ends of those trunnels protruding from the pieces of wood as they go together. That's why you need to have two pieces that don't overlap at the same point. The little diagram up above shows you what I mean, that the ends of one futtock are attached and then trunneled into the pieces of wood on the other side. You don't want them to occur. You don't want the ends of the two futtocks to match. They overlap to give the strength to both pieces. So those two pieces of the frame that I described are put together along the bottom of the ship base here, and this would be called the midship bend. This is the first frame that's erected on the keel, and all of the others are counted forward or aft of that, so that each frame is identified, and in the diagrams, the frame and the shapes of them are identified, all beginning and counting from this midship bend. So here is the keel in place with the stem in place, and 7 of these frames put into position. They're held in place with their own weight on the keel, and you can see small bands that have been attached to keep them in position until they can be more permanently attached to the keel itself. And this process would continue through a good bit of the length of the ship, enough so that you could begin working on the inside. This is the picture that I love. This is the background of the picture that I began the talk with. As you move farther back toward the aft end of the ship, you can see the stem here at the beginning, so you know that's the bow. These curves actually follow a lovely reverse curve here and are bolted into the keel itself. So here's a picture showing you the cant frames up in the forward. Cant in the terms of cantilever, a supporting an angled brace. These are the cant frame will come in here and are mortised into the stem. This is the stem that we were looking at before, and they will be turned to provide force toward the forward end of the ship. And they're much more closely together. They're not separated. They're right adjacent to each other in the construction of the ship. So once those frames are in place, the next thing to do is to tie them together, make sure that they're stable. And you do that by putting in a keelson. This little diagram in the upper left-hand corner shows the keelson. It is the piece on the inside of the ship above the keel. So the first thing you do is take another large piece of white oak and square it up, which is what they're doing here. And then you run it around the end of the freight shed, the freight shed to the front end of the tent at the other end, and you pull it in to the inside of the ship. Now, this can get a little confusing as well, but what you have here is a come along that's pulling this large piece of white oak in over the bow of the ship. Here's the stem, just to keep you oriented. The cant frames on this side had obviously not been put in because you need to get this piece of wood in. This piece of wood will match. This is a forward part of the keelson. There's 2 pieces. The aft part is already in place, and you can see it circled, the end of that circled in red down here, but you can't see very well what's going to happen. And so I've introduced this slide. This is a slide of 2 men cutting the scarf joint in the after end of the keelson. So the keelson is off to the right. The new piece of wood that will be coming in will be fitted in closely to the one that's already in place. There's some pretty careful woodworking going on, even though these are very, very large and heavy pieces of wood that we're working with. So here comes the forward piece being gently maneuvered into position, and then it's turned over and notches are cut in it that will allow it to match the frame pieces that it will be sitting on. And Then the holes are drilled from the keelson down through the frames, down through the keel, and silicon bronze rods are pounded in down through those holes, and bolts are then fastened at the bottom of the keel to hold them together. And again, you can see up here the frames, pieces of frame sitting on the keel, and this fellow will attach the bronze rod nuts to the rod that once it's pounded down. So this is Rob Stevens. He's our shipwright, and we couldn't have done this without him. So he's working entirely with a volunteer crew of local people from the colleges and the Navy base on Wednesdays and Saturdays from 9 to 3 over what's now 10 years. He's the one that managed to put this whole thing together, and we couldn't have done it without him. So meanwhile, at the other end of the ship, here's the stern post being fitted to the keel. This is the support for the transom to come. Here's one of the transom supports being hoisted up into position. Then the pre-assembled transom was fitted into place. Of course, that would be built at a different part and then brought to the ship when it was needed. So there's all the framing. When that's all done, she looks like a wicker basket. And now we need to give that basket strength and stability. Horizontal stability is provided by installing 6 rows of beams inside the ship on both sides. Each row is made up of 3 pieces of white oak, 2.5 by 6 inches wide. And what you see here is the fellow working to make these pieces lie smoothly from one frame to the other. This is called fairing, and it has to be done at each one of the frames. What the gentleman's doing is moving that long piece of wood batten forward and aft, sliding it up and down frame by frame and finding spots where one is higher than its neighbor, and he'll be grinding those off. And then in the cases that there's one that's low, we would have to take some epoxy and put them on, put that on to have it sit right. Basically, what you're trying to do is have them all sit right next to each other. These clamps then will come in, will be fastened port and starboard in both the bilge area, which is down at the bottom of the keel, and also up near the upper ends of the frames. So these horizontal pieces, for the clamp to fit properly, it's got to have its inboard surface positioned with its neighbors, but it also has another difficulty. It has to bend, primarily in the forward end. And for this to happen, they have to be heated, and in order to do that, once the clamp would be cut and planed to the correct width, we would take it and soak it in the river for 3 or 4 days, and then put the forward end into a long wooden steam box. That's this end here, and you can see that steam from an old rug cleaner, that's that yellow device in the background, would be run into the box. And after about 4 hours, the board would be taken out of the steam box and carried into the boat shed, where it gets handed up between the aft frames. You got to still keep openings between there so that you can get the wood in, and brought inside, okay, to the ship, and then forced into place using hand clamps and brute strength. You have about 20 minutes when this wood is steam bent, steam heated, before the wood dries, after which it will retain the curve that's been forced into it, so that at a subsequent work session, it can be drilled and attached to frames by trunnels, just as those double sawn frames had been assembled. For additional strength, the clamps were also fastened to the frames at several points with stainless steel lag bolts. This picture shows the forward end of the ship after both the port and starboard sets of the bilge clamps have been installed. And this picture shows work on the shear clamps. This is up at the forward end of the ship, but up at the upper end of the frame pieces, what they call the shear line of the ship. The same procedure, of course, is being done all along the midline and at the aft end of the hull as well. Now let's shift to the outside of the ship. Horizontal members mounted on the outside of the hull are called planks. They have the same requirement of having to fit with their neighbors and follow a smooth curve along the length of the ship. So fairing would be needed on the outside of the ship as well. And that's what that fellow there is doing. You can see the sawdust all over him, or when he finds a high spot, he'll grind it down. The process of steaming and mounting planks is the same as was done for the clamps. Here's a hot plank going into the lower section on the starboard side of the ship. And in the next slide, I hope we can make this work. In the next slide, I have a video of this process that shows a plank being maneuvered into place on an upper section of the ship. So let's give this a try. All right, so now now I have to do next. Oh, now it's doing it again. Hang on, I got to figure this one out next. There we go. Okay, so the planks and the clamps are attached to the frames by trunnels the same way that these frames were. Trunnels are 1-inch thick, 12-inch long pegs of locust wood. Locust is denser than oak, so that when the ship is put in the water, the oak around the trunnel will swell and clamp down tightly onto it. Trunnels are driven into pre-drilled holes using a 12-pound sledge. It's work best done by young, buff Navy seamen like this fellow, instead of old folks like me, but sometimes the young ponies aren't around. This picture shows the high degree of curvature that's needed for planks that get mounted at the bow. We cracked a few of them, I must admit, until we worked out the timing and the procedures for steaming and mounting the wood. Once the ship was fully planked, the next step was to caulk it. Because when he wanted the caulking to be done well, particularly below the waterline, we hired this young man, a professional caulker, to do the job for us. I didn't even know this was a profession, but he evidently has enough work to make his living at it. Using caulking irons of varying sizes, he's got one in his hand, you can see there, and a large mallet. He forces cotton into the gaps between planks. Of course, the colonists wouldn't have had cotton in 1607, but they would have used some other plant fiber. And then he pounded in oakum, which is a tar-treated hemp product that the colonists probably brought with them. With the caulking complete, we're pretty sure she'll be watertight. The seams were then painted and sealed with a putty made of pitch and waxy cement, and the hull was then sanded in preparation. Yeah, that was supposed to be the slide. The hull was then sanded in preparation for it to be painted. The next construction step was to install deck beams. This picture shows how a large 4-inch thick beams have been cut into a camber, a curved surface, and mortised into the shear clamps and into each other to provide a really solid structure. And there's a little diagram again to help you figure that out. Here is a below deck view looking aft at this time in the construction. Each full deck beam is attached to the hull frame by right-angled blocks of wood called knees. You can see 2 of them there, hanging just behind the yellow power cord on the right. A hanging knee is positioned vertically. A lodging knee is installed horizontally. These knees are fashioned from the roots of a hackmatack tree, a member of the larch family. The normal growth pattern for a hackmatack root system forms a sturdy right angle bend, much stronger than any nailed or glued joint could ever be. Shipbuilders have been using hackmatack roots for over 600 years to give rigidity to deck frames and other structural members of wooden ships. The deck framing for Virginia required 48 of those hand-fashioned hackmatack knees. Here's a view of the deck looking aft once it was fully planked with white pine. The upper bulwark frames were also planked with white pine. They aren't in position yet, but they would be the walls of the side of the ship. Here's a photo of the partially finished rudder, the mechanism that steers the ship. This was the last project we worked on before COVID hit in 2020. The rudder's 14 feet long, constructed from 8-inch blocks of white oak that are through bolted together. It'll be mounted to the transom with traditional iron fittings called gudgeons and pintles, hardware the colonists would have brought with them for that purpose. And there's that little diagram again. Work on Virginia slowed considerably when the pandemic came to Maine. Many volunteers stopped coming. We stopped public visits, changed our work plan. We opened the work site 5 days a week to our volunteers, but we divided the crews into different shifts and began having signups for specific days instead of just inviting people to show up whenever they wanted. Work continued in small, socially distant groups that were allowed to coordinate, work on special projects for their own choosing. We also took advantage of some COVID downtime to get permits and build a wharf next to the freight shed. We built 2 pontoon float docks that will be attached to dolphins in the spring and an aluminum ramp that will extend down from the shore. The next 2 slides show rather heroic results achieved by just 3 volunteers working alone during the pandemic. You're looking at the starboard side of the ship at the aft end, at the keel. Those are 2 mold poured lead ballast blocks, each weighing 3,000 pounds. 6 of them, placed end to end, provide external ballast for the ship. Each one was jacked up by hand, braced, and then drilled from above, down through the keelson, the frame, the keel, and finally the lead, and fastened below with silicon bronze rods. In this picture now, you're looking along the starboard side of the vessel, but you're looking aft, so you can see all 6 of these keel blocks fitted into position. And then last summer, a shiny new Coast Guard required diesel engine was installed, a 175 horsepower Volvo Penta. Work continued on several pieces of deck equipment. This is a hand-operated windlass. It's positioned so it can raise both the anchor and hoist the main yard, though not, of course, at the same time. You only see one handle there, but it would normally be operated by two persons. Oh, I guess you do see 2 handles there, right? Each with a square-headed handle that pulls down in the exposed holes, and then that pawl, that wooden pawl, is the piece of wood, drops into position and holds the windlass at whatever location you've moved it to. This is one of the 3 knight heads, the turning block that's bolted to the deck where halyards come down and will be led over to the windlass. This is for the main halyard. Rob admits that the carving might bear some resemblance. Here's a view of the after deck. The mizzenmast will be mounted just after that hatch. You can't see it particularly well in this picture because of all the lumber that's stacked there. The rudder head will project up through that hole in the deck that you see near the taffrail. This fall, we sanded the hull in preparation for painting the bottom before cold weather set in. Here are 2 pictures of Virginia with bottom paint, fore and aft. She got 3 coats of it. In the aft view on the right, you can see the propeller shaft protruding from the keel. Jane Stevens died in 2008, but her dream lives on. The launch date is June 4, and you're all invited. We'll spend the summer rigging the ship, fitting her out, conducting sea trials, learning how to sail her. Virginia will also have to pass Coast Guard inspection and stability trials in order for her to carry paying passengers. Here's an artistic rendering of what we hope will soon come to be shows Virginia resting safely at her wharf in front of the park-like recreational area next to the freight shed. There we can maintain her and people can come and enjoy and learn what the ship has to offer. We won't be operational at sea until the summer of 2023, but we're already expanding our land-based educational curricula and exhibits. We offer a summer lecture series. We've done that for the last 4 years with topics such as local weather forecasting, understanding tides, and geology of the Kennebec Valley. We run a youth boat building school in the summertime, and we hope to offer maritime topics like tool making and ship design. We have an annual Women's Shipbuilding Day, which we expand to a week once the ship is launched, and more space in the workshop is available. Once at sea, we'll offer sail handling, navigation, and other marine sciences. In summary, Maine's first ship is constructing a sturdy seagoing vessel with reasonably accurate 17th century hull and rig design that we think will be well suited to the inshore environment in which we plan to use her. We're developing a museum and educational center to promote an appreciation of Maine's maritime heritage and an understanding of both the history of the Popham Colony and its relationship with the Wabanaki people. And we're preserving the Bath Freight Shed as a home for Virginia and a site for community activities. We welcome your participation in this exciting adventure. Thank you very much. Shall I stop the sharing? Yes. And start my video. Hello, Owen.
Jim, that was terrific. It was absolutely terrific. Thank you. But it's just fascinating. It's hard to look at those huge pieces of wood and see how you've put them together the way, you know, a young person would put together tiny little pieces of balsa or something to make a ship model. And here you are. The weight of those frames must have been enormous. Were there any injuries or anything that you?
No, actually, I'm delighted that you asked the question. I also happen to be the safety officer for this program. We have not had a major injury. We've had splinters and little chisel cuts and things of that nature. Nobody fell off. We have scaffolding around the ship that looks like you're going to fall off it every time you step on it. But no, we've been lucky to not have any injuries at all. Yeah, it's big, and there's a general call for all hands on deck when someone needs to move a large piece of wood, and there are levers. I dropped a lot of pictures in order to try and make my time frame here, but one of them was getting that diesel engine up by hand on a tripod structure that was put on the deck of the ship and then hung over, so it wasn't even an equilateral or 3 legs of equal support. I didn't think they could do it, but they did bring that up, and then nobody dropped it. So, and then put it down into the hold. So, yeah.
Did the volunteers have any training prior to doing this? I mean,
no. There are, as you might know, there's some self-selection. We have a couple of engineers, 1 or 2 people that did work on large ships and understand ship construction and ship repair. But no, you showed up, and the task that was necessary, you were offered to learn it. Sanding, grinding, whatever it was. Rob Stevens has built several of these. And without going into fully his background, but one of them was a Snorri, which was a Viking longship that they built in Denmark and sailed it across to Greenland. I mean, there's a number of great stories about this. And his career as a shipbuilder has been involved in a variety of not only building initially, but what it really is now doing is maintaining a lot of ships. So he knows what he's doing. But no, the rest of us, I never knew anything about, I didn't know anything about pieces of wood that size when I showed up. But the technique is the same. And you build a small ship, you build a large, and when you get to fiberglass, it's a little different.
Right. So, I mean, I was looking at how you filled and fared, you know, to get everything smooth and all. They wouldn't have had those same techniques in the 17th century.
Oh, they had they had planes. They had good iron that could be made, sharpened. I mean, Yeah, the rabbit plane was recognized at that time, and we have some of the similar tools that were available. Adzes were quite good for a good woodworker can carve a piece of hard oak into something quite pretty. And in fact, you know, it's easier when you're dealing with larger pieces of wood. If you try to deal with something that's 2.5 inches long and make a little fastener that fits on a boat, that's difficult. But yeah, we have a set of tools, and draw knives are historically available at that time. Ships were moving all across the world by that time, and the techniques were known.
I want to ask one more question. We have some questions from our viewers as well. When you look at that ship, and you spoke about the colonists originally using it, or I guess they didn't, but you talk about you using it to travel up and down the coast. It just doesn't look like something that would go across the ocean.
Well,
you know what I mean? It looks like.
Well, yeah, there's two choices. Remember, it's about a 60-day sail of the trade winds. Okay, so you're out there for that period of time. That the ship record can have known that. There's two sets of rigging on the ship. If you want a maneuverable ship that's going to go up a river and around a corner, you need a fore and aft rig. Okay, and so that's the lateen sail that's on the end of the ship. When they went back across the ocean, and we're dealing with trade winds, constant winds, then they would be shifted to an offshore rig, which would give you the square sails that you're more familiar with. Those are the ones that people talk about. And as you know, as a sailor, you wouldn't go difficult to go many days with your sail all out to one side and the boat rocks back and forth. But if you set a square sail at the top, you set a forward sail that's square, and you just let the trade wind blow you for 60 days and figure out how to take that all down when you get in off the coast of Devon. That works. But what you can't do is go back and forth between the two. So if you're going to try and sail along a coast and in and out of rocky areas, you want to be maneuverable, and you want to have fore and aft sails. So that was recognized as well. There are a few places, Nile River sail development, for example, where the current was so strong in a general direction, and luckily enough, the wind blows there from the north, so that you can from the south you can go up the river, and then you can come back down with the current. There's a variety of different settings that would have grown up, but these folks were making North Atlantic sail structures, and those were not surprising. Many of the ships were rigged that same way.
One of our viewers asks, could you actually sail this version of the Virginia to England?
Could?
Could.
Yeah, you could. I mean, that's been done. The boats of 20 tons have crossed, and the Discovery was a smaller ship, the one that came to. Yes, the answer is yes. If you pick a right weather window, which it seems from the notes these guys did not pay that much attention to. They didn't really understand the weather. And then you run the risk of being run down by a whale or being caught in a storm. I wouldn't go in September, but those are things we know that they did not know. They took a ship that was this ship was never intended to cross the Atlantic, but the one they built originally was never intended, but it did it twice.
Amazing. One of our viewers asks, to what degree did you try to use traditional tools and methods?
When available and possible, we're using chisels and we're not using hand saws, though. We use power saws, we use drills, we use epoxy when we need to. Most of the ship was not put together with epoxy, with those not splits, but shims that we're putting on the frames to make them fair. That sometimes was done. But the question was not that. The question was hand tools. For the most part, we're not using hand tools. For cutting small pieces, yes. But for drilling, there are those folks drilled by hand as well. We've got several of the drills in our museum or similar artifacts. Harry Bryan can drill a 2-inch piece of wood, put a hole through a 12-inch wide board by hand. You and I can't do that, but
Yeah.
but we're trying to make two things.
Yeah.
We want it to be traditionally designed 17th century structure, but we also want to have it be certified for a paying customer. And the
Sure.
Coast Guard has its own issues with that. They would just as soon not have any hand-built boats
Right.
on commercial waters. I mean, you want to build a boat and take your friends sailing, that's fine, but
Right.
they don't want you to.
Not paying customers, no.
Well, yeah, there are concerns, and there are accidents that occur with the tall ships industry
Yeah,
as well.
of course.
They're watching very closely as these get constructed.
Did the original ship have, what did the original ship have for a keel? It didn't have that kind of a lead.
No, not at all. It would have probably carried rock, carried inboard ballast, and it wouldn't have had an external ballast at all. That really wasn't put on at the time.
Right.
But you loaded rock, and like the little boats, you catch a big fish, you throw a rock out, and you end up keeping your balance. I think on a larger ship, the same general pattern occurred, but the cargo would be stored down below, and that would provide ballast. And packing that cargo so that you had fore and aft balance during a complicated seaway was a real trick. You can't have, that's the term for a loose cannon, when a cannon breaks loose on a gunship and rolls from one side to the other, and you're carrying 5,000 pounds of lead from one side to the other, 20 feet off the waterline. Yeah, that causes an unbalance that you don't want to.
It gets pretty destructive.
Yeah.
And did you give the dimensions of the ship?
She's 54 feet long. She's about 18 feet wide at the widest, at the midship end. I don't have a height for the rigging. We haven't really, rigging has been built in our freight shed and is available and ready to go up, but it hasn't. Obviously, you don't do that until the ship's in the water.
Sure.
So that'll be a summer project.
Sure.
I don't quite know what it is. We want it to get under the Bath Bridge, though. It will fit there. So look and see what the height of the Bath
Bridge. Yeah.
Coastal guidance. We're better than that. So.
And what does she draw?
We think she's going to draw about 4 feet. I don't want to speak too far out of turn, but Rob got up there on the day when we had to draw the water line, and he sketched it. He said, "Okay, here it is. Here it is." I mean, there's a lot of calculations for displacement, and the nautical design folks have gone through this quite well. But I'll tell you, it's until you put it in the water, you never know where it's going to sit.
Right. Amazing. I think I have one more question. Hang on a sec.
Yeah, it was the one from the Q&A. Someone wanted to know how long the ship will last.
That's a fair question. I would say that 20 years is a long time for a wooden ship, any time of, even if she's cared for. Not cared for, of course, you can go down a lot sooner than that, but I wouldn't expect anything more than 20 years from a ship like this. Now, modern day maintenance, if you the Mayflower was just redone. The Mayflower was given to us in 1957, I think. She came over to celebrate, forget what it was she was celebrating, but nonetheless some centennial of some sort. And she had been redone twice since then. So what are we looking at there? 70 years, every 30 years or so you redo it. If you take it apart and replace the broken parts, which is not the same as how long she will last, you can extend the life of these things. And there is even one or two pieces of wood in the Constitution, which is that ship in the Boston Navy Yard, which is original, way down on the inside and protected with tar and everything else, but not many pieces original.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, and we're very grateful for your putting this on. You have just a dizzying number of slides. That's really quite. I mean, this talk is quite a project. So.
Well, I do, and I have more than that. I could. There's details that are coming along. This is going to have to be broken into 2 or 3 slides, and then once we get rigging up, there's going to be a whole new story and a learning curve to figure out how to sail it.
Yeah.
How to control these lines and what timing do you have, and And there's some question as to whether or not the best place to do this is 12 miles up a narrow river with a 4-knot current. It might be nice to do it out in Cape Cod Bay somewhere, or Vineyard Sound.
I think Marblehead Harbor might be a more conducive.
Marblehead Harbor, yeah, someplace like that. So
like
at any
that.
rate, we work with what we've got, and I think this is a fun story. June 4th, come on up and visit. You got a place to stay, and should be exciting.
And just so we're oriented, we saw a bridge in the background. That's the bridge there in Bath. And the other side of that is where Bath Iron Works is, right?
Yes,
So
yes, right. Bath Iron Works is on the downstream side of the river, and we're just on the upstream side of the river.
Right.
I'm sorry, the downstream side of the bridge and upstream
Right.
side of the bridge. So.
Right.
Good.
Well, thank you again so much. This is terrific. Thank you.
All right. Good night, Carolyn. Thank you for your support.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us.
All right.
As we sign off, you might mention another few things that the Athenaeum is going to be doing in the near future. On the 29th of this month, we have a photo historian that will be joining us at 6 p.m. And one brings photos, and she can analyze these photos and tell you various things about what they represent historically. On May 5th is the annual meeting, and all members of the Salem Athenaeum are invited to attend that. On May 18th is a lecture on island medicine by Dr. Chuck Radis, who's a primary care physician who lives on Peaks Island off the coast of Portland, and travels by boat to the various islands around him to attend the patients. And then on June 12th, we are having our community read of Frederick Douglass's most famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And that'll be at 3 p.m. at the Tabernacle Church on 50 Washington Street in Salem. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did.
Thank you.
Good night.